Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, April the 7th, 2021. It is currently 10:41 a.m. Central Time, and once again, the microphone is on. I've hit the big red go live button. We're live on the air. I've already been here over an hour and a half, and we only have one live episode to show for it. So I'm not making a lot of progress this morning. I always tend to go longer than I think. When I'm driving here to the church, I'm always like, okay, I got like 7 things I need to do today, 7 programs I want to do live. And then when I leave, I'm like, you've done 3, you've done 2. You're a failure, because I always go longer than I intended. But hopefully, all I can do is turn on the microphone, and what happens is what happens, because it's live. There's no do-overs. There's no editing. It's live. It's what it is. It's organic. It's real. And hopefully you appreciate that with all of the mistakes, the things not stated correctly. It's just all there for the world to hear. And I hope that it does at times prove to be beneficial. But for right now, we're going to have to return to a subject that's not a pleasant one. It's not pleasant. It's horrible. It deals with the history of the United States of America. Everyone needs to be aware of this history. Everyone needs to learn this history. If you homeschool your children, they need to be very well informed about it. If your children go to public school and they're not learning it there, then it's your responsibility as a parent to, add to their education, to supplement their education with things that they need to know. And I hope that you will listen carefully. Now, this is not the first time I've discussed this subject. I just looked back in 2019. Back in 2019, I did a podcast episode in regards to this history. And I did it for the Socratic Circle podcast. We won't go into why. I've done so many different podcasts trying to do different things. I won't go into all the reasons. Sometimes things are very disjointed. Even now I have probably too many podcasts, and there's reasons for that. It goes back to, at one point we had a standalone church app that was really cool, and I really loved having that standalone church app, but that company got bought out by another company, and they changed the whole platform, and it wouldn't do what I needed it to do for it to be worth $150 a month that it cost us to have. So we stopped that, and but at that time there were all the different sections within the standalone church app. There were all these different sections, and for those sections to work, different sections, I needed separate RSS feeds to load into those sections to bring the content to the church app. Well, then I would have the way to do that. If I was going to have these different sections focused on certain content, I had to create different podcasts with different RSS feeds. So then that content would be right there, instead of just all of this disjointed. Well, you're talking about this here. I wanted people to know, okay, if I'm looking for that content, here he's talking about, the Theology Central podcast. Here's the sermons. Here's if he's talking about Catholicism. Here if he's talking about philosophy. And so I try to have it separate on the church app. So the thought process was good, but once that went away, then I was left with all of these different podcasts floating around. And then I was like, which ones am I going to maintain? Which ones am I not going to maintain? And I still haven't got it all figured out. But we're basically down to the Theology Central podcast, the VBC podcast, and the VBC Bible Institute. The non-Catholic Catholic is still there to focus on Catholicism. We may go back to that because the church, we're supposed to be studying the Catholic Catechism, and, we're way behind on that. And if you don't understand why we're doing that, then just email me and I will explain. Don't jump to any conclusions. But yes, so there's a lot out there. So back in 2019, I turned on the microphone to talk about a very horrific and tragic event that happened in American history. And now a new podcast is being released by ABC News talking about this horrible event. Now, I'm glad in 2021 it's getting even more attention, but my goal here this morning is very simple. First, I want to inform you once again of this horrific event that happened in American history, give you a preview of the podcast, and then I really want to challenge the current culture about something that they really need to think about. And I think every Christian needs to have this challenge in their pocket, ready to use when you're dealing with people in the culture. Because listen, this is so very important. I want to make sure you understand this is a very important principle before we even get to this horrible event. I want you to really think about this. Even though our culture may be moving away from Christianity, maybe they've decided they don't like Christianity, they condemn Christianity for being too close-minded, too judgmental, too dogmatic, all of the things that many people are moving away from Christianity because they claim Christianity is flawed because it's so judgmental, condemning, dogmatic. Even though people are moving away from that system, and even though they may state that as reasons, I don't want you to ever forget this. The world has not become any less dogmatic, any less condemning, any less judgmental. They've only replaced the morality of Christianity with their own system of morality, which then they turn around and say, you're wrong, you're condemned, you're condemned, you're condemned, and they judge. Yes, there was a time that many people looked at Christianity and was like, you're so judgmental and you don't even follow the Bible. The Bible says, judge not lest ye be judged, and all you do is judge. Now, of course, for them to say that, they had to be making a judgment, but that's a whole different problem. But they did not like it, and they moved away from it. They wanted a sense of freedom, and they didn't want anyone to be condemning them. But times have changed. The world now is just as condemning, just as dogmatic. But the difference is they are condemning, in a sense, those within Christianity, but they've just replaced Christianity with their own system. Basically, they've got their priest, they've got their clergy, they listen to their podcast, they listen to their teachers, they listen to their doctrine, and if you don't follow their doctrine, well, now you're a heretic and you're condemned. And the world has to see this. So whenever people leave Christianity and kind of become this now, they've got their new religion and they're condemning everything, I constantly try to challenge them. Well, wait a minute. On what basis are you judging me? On what basis are you judging my system? What makes your system right? Where does morality flow from? Where is the origin of morality? Where does morality come from? Now, I just spent an hour and a half talking about this in the last live broadcast. Let me just mention it. You have very few options where morality arises. It arises either from the majority. The majority consensus determines what is right or determines what is wrong. Okay, some people say yes, and then when they look back in history and see what the majority did, they're like, no, the majority is wrong. The minority is right, the minority. And then they'll look to the minority and say, see, the minority is right. And I'm like, okay, so the minority determines morality? Okay, then why do we condemn the KKK? They're in the minority. Why do we condemn people who want to be able to have relations with children under the, with sexual relations with children? Why are they wrong? They're in the minority. No. Okay, I don't like the majority. I don't like the individual. The individual comes up with morality. Okay, well, if you come up with morality and your morality and my morality, we don't agree, then can you say that I'm wrong? Well, no. Okay, well, then nobody can be wrong. So why do you still condemn people? So nobody ever thinks about this. It's either the majority, it's the minority, or it's the individual. Or there's a transcendent system of morality that is outside of all of us, and that we are to submit ourselves to it, and we have no control over it. We can't modify it. We cannot change it. We cannot twist it. We're either we stand condemned by it or we can stand justified by it. And which is it? And nobody ever wants to have that discussion within our society. But Christians need to constantly be ready to bring these issues to people's mind. You don't have to be a jerk about it. You just need to say, wait a minute. You seem very judgmental. You seem very condemning, and you seem to very much have a system of dogma. Where does this come from? What makes it right? Where does this morality come from? And you have to question them. But we have a lot of this in our culture today. We look back to the past. We judge the past. We judge the past morality based on a present morality. How does that work? I want you to keep that principle in mind because that's going to come into play as we discuss this, because I'm going to take this horrible event in American history and I'm going to lead us to this kind of philosophical question, and we're going to look at a number of other issues as well. And we're going to take a hard look at the Christian church as well in the midst of all of this. So are you ready? Thinking cap sign. All right, we're going to go back into American history. We're going to start by going to a podcast that I listen to every morning called Start Here. It comes to us from ABC News. I listen to a couple of morning news. Basically, there's a couple of podcasts that will start your morning by saying, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what's everyone going to be talking about today, right? Start Here. NPR, is it called First Start? I think it's called First Start. But basically, Start Here and the NPR one, I'd have to look it up really quick. I'll look it up while we're listening to some audio clips to make sure I give you the right name. But there's these podcasts that basically start your morning going, hey, here's what you need to know about today. And I always listen to them around 5 or 6 a.m. just so that I know these are the topics today. Doesn't mean when I get here at the church I talk about them, but I at least like to know what's going on where I can start thinking about them from a biblical perspective. But yesterday morning, I was listening to Start Here from ABC News, and they mentioned a new podcast, and they mentioned this horrific event that happened in American history that I talked about back in 2019. May have even done an episode about it in 2018. And so that's where we're going to go. We're going to go back to this horrible event. We're going to see what they have to say about it, and we're going to ask some very important questions. So are you ready? And I'm going to give you the information about the podcast. So I'm going to try to accomplish a lot in a very short amount of time. I hope you're ready. Here we go.
Yesterday, we continued to hear dramatic testimony in the case against former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin.
Was this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Minneapolis Chief of Police Madera Arredondo testifying against one of his former officers, telling the jury that what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd violated the policy and values of the department.
We also continue to get reaction at the private level and the corporate level to these new voting laws in the state of Georgia. And really, the message echoing from Minnesota to Georgia is a similar one, that this is a moment of reckoning.
What does it mean to be black in America?
What it means to be black in America means that you're criminal. I feel that being black in America is illegal.
Activists in Minneapolis are saying this is not the story of one dead man on the street. It's a question of whether police can physically assault you and get away with it. It's not a question of longer lines at the polling places, they're saying in Georgia. It's whether you can restrict all the things that just happened to enhance black voter turnout. And there might be no better example of one thing disguised as another than what for a long time was known as the Tulsa Race Riots.
We have trauma that has been passed down for decades now.
Historians say that was actually never the right thing to call it because it obscures what actually happened.
If you're going to tell the story right and don't tell it white.
Which is why we now know it as the Tulsa Race Massacre. And later tonight on ABC, Steve Osunsami is reporting on this, an in-depth piece for the primetime show Soul of a Nation. But you don't have to wait that long because this morning, his new podcast about this topic has dropped. It's called Tulsa's Buried Truth. Steve joins us now. And Steve, I feel like it was right after the death of George Floyd that a lot of Americans were pointing to this moment in Tulsa, a different state almost 100 years ago, but people were pointing to it as something to draw on. Why is that? Like, what is it about these events?
Well, I would say that George Floyd changed the conversation that was happening in this country on race, without question. And what started happening is that we started looking at stories like what happened in Tulsa through a new lens.
Still, burned down Brian's tailor shop.
And so there are now Hollywood TV shows that have focused on what happened.
Best Negro surgeon in all America.
HBO's series Lovecraft Country and Watchmen have both focused on what happened in Tulsa. And then, of course, our podcast, where we really go into depth about what happened, why it happened, and why it was kept a secret for so long. In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a very well-to-do black community known as the Greenwood neighborhood. And what happened is freed slaves who left the Southeast, set up these different communities, these freedom towns as they were called, in communities across America.
The Greenwood community as a business community was a community of necessity. There would have been no Greenwood community had there not been segregation.
And because of the discrimination of the times, a person who lived in one of these neighborhoods, they couldn't go to a shoe store and try on shoes, or go to a dress store and try on clothing. So they formed their own communities and economies. And so this economy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a neighborhood called Greenwood, which was on the other side of the train tracks, was so successful that people started calling it Black Wall Street. But what was also happening at the time is, this is after the war, you had white Americans who really resented the community and the people of Greenwood, who were doing better than some white Americans on the other side of the train tracks.
It was a really scandalous, false narrative about an attempted rape in broad daylight in downtown Tulsa.
It all came to a head when a black shoe shiner by the name of Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator, and then things blew up.
Well, what happened here in Tulsa on May 31st through June 1st of 1921 was indeed 18 hours of terror.
White residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma found their reason to burn Greenwood to the ground.
State-sponsored terrorism, where the sheriff deputized 2,000 to 10,000 members of a white mob that descended upon Greenwood.
People's homes were burned as black people ran out of their homes because of the fires. They were shot dead. By some reports, hundreds of black Americans were killed.
The people most likely to be shot and killed are people who were defending themselves.
Now I got to jump in here. If you've never seen photographs of the Tulsa Race Massacre, again, some articles will call it the Tulsa Race Riot, but it was a Tulsa Race Massacre. I think that is very accurate. If you've never seen photographs of it, it is horrific. It looks like a war zone. It is shocking that this happened right here in the United States of America. And I have a feeling that many of you never heard this taught in school. It never came out. I don't know. I know in my school, I never heard anyone teach it. I think my mother taught me about it. My mother was always putting books in front of me to read. And, I could go into the whole history there. But and I spent a lot of my childhood. I wasn't like other kids. Other kids would wake up and go, "Hey, we're going to go play." And I'd be like, "Hey, I'm going to walk down to South First." It was the busy street not far from our house. And I would wait for the bus, get on the bus, ride the bus, because the bus station was right across the street from the library. And then I'd go, and I would spend all day in the library by myself as a kid. I just hung out at the library reading anything and everything, no matter what section. I was in all the sections. And so somewhere I came across something about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I don't have any. I know I never was taught about it in school. I don't know if I even really understood what happened. I may have even actually, and this is sad, but I may have even actually thought, oh, someone did something horrible in that community and nobody would do anything about it. And I may have even had a completely misunderstanding of what occurred. There's a possibility that I could have had a wrong understanding. I mean, I was young. And then on HBO, certain shows, The Watchmen, by no means a Christian show, by no means can I recommend it, okay? By no means. But I think the very first episode of the Watchmen series on HBO, I think it's on HBO Max, depending on, if you just watch the first 10 minutes of the very first episode, the show starts in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right in the middle of the Race Massacre. So this really started bringing it to light. And a lot of people stopped and was like, whoa, wait a minute. What happened? And then I thought it was going to start getting some mainstream discussion. And then it kind of went away and no one really talked about it. And now, finally, it's trying to get a push more back into the mainstream. Everyone needs to know about this. Everyone needs to understand what occurred. everyone needs to know. And I would strongly recommend you subscribe to the podcast that they are mentioning here. And we're going to talk more about that podcast here in just a second. But the Tulsa Race Massacre, let's go back. I'm going to go back and listen to this. I'm just going to back this up a few seconds. I always say a few seconds, and then it backs up far more than it wants to. But here we go. All right. Actually, that went the wrong way. All right, here we go. I think it may have went too far. If it backed up too far, we'll fix it. Here we go.
Had white Americans who really resented the community and the people of Greenwood, who were doing better than some white Americans on the other side of the train tracks.
It was a really scandalous, false narrative about an attempted rape in broad daylight in downtown Tulsa.
It all came to a head when a black shoeshiner by the name of Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator, and then things blew up.
Well, what happened here in Tulsa on May 31st through June 1st of 1921 was indeed 18 hours of terror.
White residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma found their reason to burn Greenwood to the ground.
State-sponsored terrorism where the sheriff deputized 2,000 to 10,000 members of a white mob that descended upon Greenwood.
People's homes were burned as black people ran out of their homes because of the fires. They were shot dead. By some reports, hundreds of black Americans were killed.
Please note this. This is very important. Depending on the articles you read, the claim that hundreds die, some claim only 36 died. There's more investigations going. They're looking for maybe some mass graves to see if they can determine exactly how many people died. So just know that if you stop listening to this and you go Google this, you're probably going to come across reports that say 36 people died. I think some say 39, but they're claiming hundreds. So I think there's still a lot to be figured out, but whether it was 36 or whether it was 100, whether it was 20, whatever the number was, it was still horrific and horrible that this occurred, and we need to be aware of what happened, and we need to understand it. All right, so let's continue.
People most likely to be shot and killed are people who were defending themselves.
People ran for their lives, never to come back. There were bombs that were dropped from above by white townspeople who ran to their crop dusters nearby and threw Molotov cocktails from above, burning the homes.
And when you see the pictures, the before and after, you know it's a war zone. There's nothing left standing.
This was the execution of black excellence.
I was going to say, it's like you hear about a lynching and you think one or two victims. This was almost the lynching of a town of an identity in a way.
Yes, the execution of black excellence.
I had no idea.
Why is that? How did that happen, in your opinion?
Well, I don't know. I went to Booker T. Washington High School, which was a predominantly black high school that integrated in the early 70s. And it was not even taught at the high school level, at a predominantly historically black high school.
And it ended up being the greatest act of domestic terrorism in the state of Oklahoma that very few Americans had ever heard about because it was kept a secret.
What do you mean by secret?
There were two things that happened. On one hand, white Americans who lived in Tulsa, who were embarrassed by this, didn't want to talk about it. The historians didn't want to talk about it. The newspapers at the time were white-owned.
One of the local newspapers, the Tulsa Tribune, published an editorial 3 days after the massacre. It must not be again. It was horrific, vile language against the black community in that editorial. Yet
they described what happened to Tulsa as a Negro riot. On the other hand, you had black Americans who were afraid for their lives.
They were afraid the same kind of inhumane, savage massacre would take place again.
They had to work, the people who came back, with the very people who burned their homes and who killed their loved ones. And so there was fear in the black community about talking about what happened in Greenwood. And that continued for a very, very long time.
It's heartbreaking. Number one, just to know what they endured in their lifetimes. And then not to be able to go to the grave and give her the due respect that she so deserves, to put flowers on her grave.
And
to have a
key part, that potentially hundreds of people were killed who were buried somewhere in Tulsa where no one knew, who never saw a funeral, no death records, no official records of where they were buried, lost to their families for what is now a century. So with George Floyd, with this changing conversation, there has been a renewed interest and push for finding these dead bodies.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon.
And guess what happened in October of last year?
Today, I have the opportunity to report to you that we have now encountered human remains.
They started digging in a couple different locations where there were rumored to be these mass graves, and they found one.
I was absolutely speechless, and that doesn't happen very often.
And so they're now trying to figure out how they can test the DNA of these different bodies and possibly eventually connect them back to the families who still live in Tulsa.
What happens to the town? I mean, to this place that we're talking about that was such a big part of this. You know, you described it as, maybe it's better described as a black Main Street than a black Wall Street, but it was there, like it existed. And that doesn't necessarily exist in Tulsa or a lot of other communities in this day. Is restoring that part of the agenda? Can it be restored?
You know, when you go to that area that's still called Black Wall Street,
everything in Greenwood is pretty much owned by somebody that's not black.
What's happened is it's been very gentrified.
Tell the story right, that on this side of town, the bicycle trails are well lit and well manicured. I know because my mother lives over here.
But on the black side of town,
it hadn't been maintained.
So I visited earlier in the year and then another visit recently. And in between my two visits, one of the black business owners who owned like a hair shop, she was complaining to us when we first visited that she could no longer afford the rents. And when I came back again just recently, her business was closed. She had already moved. So over the years, there's been a lot of talk in the black community about supporting black-owned businesses and creating this safe black space for black business. History shows that black Americans had this at one point in cities like Tulsa and other cities across the country, usually as a result of Jim Crow.
Right, like this weird irony of integration happens, and now you can go to whatever store you want, but the stores that are thriving, the stores that are doing well, they're white-owned, so now you're patronizing a white-owned store.
Absolutely. Integration changed a lot, and so did the integration of public schools and universities. You know, now all of a sudden, the children of Black Wall Street could go to any school in the country. All of these things changed the nature of having a black Main Street in communities like this.
You come and look at this history. Come look at it. Come look what happened. What was done to this community. Now, after you are educated and enlightened on it, and then you find out nobody was ever paid in their losses. No one's ever been brought to justice.
But we have to underline that none of the destruction of this generational wealth would have happened if it weren't for this incredible injury. And who, if anyone, should pay for that?
What I have seen over and over again is that people who started out, this ain't nothing but a handout for black folks, they end up thinking, what can I do to help?
Yeah, that's right. You hear talk about reparations. Joe Biden talks about build back better. The question right now is, will these towns be built back in a different way than we saw just a few years ago? All right, Steve Osunsami, fascinating stuff. It's a great podcast, and it drops today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wow, so much to unpack from this. Again, I would highly recommend you look up the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Tulsa's Buried Truth. Tulsa's Buried Truth from ABC News. And there's one episode right now called The Trigger. And it says a generation of freed slaves create a new home for themselves in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But all of that is it was placed into jeopardy after an encounter in an elevator. And then you can go listen to it. It's only 29 minutes long. I would highly recommend you listen to it because you need to know this history. But there's a couple of things to unpack. I'm going to play. Well, let's just do this now. We'll just go ahead now and just go right to the trailer for the podcast so that you can hear the trailer of the podcast, because I definitely want you to subscribe to it. It's not my podcast. I'm not getting paid for promoting it, but I just want you to know this history. And podcasts are very easy ways to get information, so I want you to go listen to it and do your own research. Do your own research about it. And again, if you homeschool your children, please teach them about this. And if your kids go to a public school, then please supplement their education with this information because they need to know what happened. They need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly of American history. They need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly of Christian history. All right. But please note, no matter where you look in history, you're going to see ugly, you're going to see bad, you're going to see sinful things, which goes back to the Christian teaching of human depravity. Again, history is the study of human depravity. That's what it is. That's when you study history, you study human depravity. When you read the Bible and we read the history of even the quote unquote heroes of the faith, what do we find? We find failure and sin. That's just every Christian needs to understand that no matter what history you look into, it's the history of depravity. But here's the trailer for the podcast. Here we go.
I shudder to think sometimes what Tulsa could have been if the race massacre had never occurred.
In the early 1900s, a whole generation of freed slaves created a safe place for themselves in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They built a successful black community where black Americans could actually have agency over their own lives. Here they could own land and run businesses. It was a new America, but it wouldn't last.
This is the time of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Lynchings are still going on across the country.
It didn't take long for America's racism to reach their doorsteps. An angry white mob poured into their neighborhood one night.
Shots were fired, at which point all hell broke loose.
The racists showed no mercy.
That night, we could see them burning the Negroes part of town. It was just terrible.
And when you see the pictures, the before and after, you know it's like it's a war zone. There's nothing left standing.
And it's believed they murdered hundreds of black Americans. For a century now, people have buried the story of this massacre. People both black and white have kept it a secret.
Some people were threatened with their very lives if they talked about it.
But then more than a dozen coffins were found in an unmarked grave near the very streets where those black Americans were killed so long ago. And now the question is, are there more bodies hidden underneath Tulsa?
There is, I think, a critical mass of evidence that strongly suggests that there are mass graves somewhere in Tulsa.
I'm ABC's Steve Osunsami. In Tulsa's Buried Truth, you'll find out why the mob had it out for these black Americans in the first place, why the murders were kept a secret, and how a search that is decades overdue is helping unlock that mystery.
Doing a murder investigation 99 years after the fact is a tremendous challenge.
We'll take you inside the push to find and identify the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the fight over who should answer for these crimes today.
We need to apologize for what's been done, and we need to atone for the past.
Tulsa's Buried Truth, coming April 6th, wherever you're listening now.
There you have it. Go look it up. Please subscribe to it. Now, that's all the information. Those are the reports. There's the podcast. There's the history. You have all of that now, and you can begin to process it and have very important conversations with your family about it. I don't know the racial makeup of all of my audience. I don't know where you fall racially. I don't know. I think probably a lot of my listeners are probably white, and this is probably history you have never even heard of. It would be interesting to know those who are black, if this has been a part of your upbringing. Did you hear about this? Did people teach you about this? Was it discussed? How do you process it? I think there's clearly, I mean, look, there's a racial element that people are going to look at it from a different perspective. But there is something that we have to talk about here right now, right from the start. I want to throw this out there, and I know this may be controversial, but we have to talk about it. Whenever horrible events of the past are brought up dealing with racism, it seems that white people are very, 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 very quick to try to immediately deflect it and say, well, that was back then, has nothing to do with me, has nothing to do with now, that was back then, basically, and they may not say it this way, but it comes across this way, get over it and move on. Bad things happen, now get over it and move on. And I think for many within the white community, we don't stop to understand how this may have not only impacted the black community in the past, how it impacts them in the present, how it impacts maybe the way they view the present. I cannot understand it. I'm by no means, I have no way of understanding that perspective, since I am white and grew up in a little town in West Texas called Buffalo Gap, for crying out loud, population, 300 people. And you know that, and I don't even know if we had 300 people when I lived there. Okay. There wasn't a traffic light in the entire town. I don't even know if there were stop signs back then. Okay. And Buffalo Gap, beautiful place. And we could talk about the history of Native Americans in Buffalo Gap. It was called Buffalo Gap because the Native Americans there was these large hills that Buffalo Gap kind of lays in the middle of, and there's these large hills where there would be buffalo herds, and they would run those herds, in a sense, off those cliffs to kill them, to then use, not the whole herd, but some of them, to then kill them and then use their hide for whatever, and use them. So there are buffalo around that area from the Native Americans, and we could talk about the different things that happened to the Native Americans there. In fact, if you go into Buffalo Gap, right when you get to one of the main, there's only really one street that goes through Buffalo Gap, but you get there. There's some historical markers that talk about the history of Native Americans and some of the battles with some of the tribes at that time. But as far as the black experience, I don't have a lot of, I have a small connection with that experience. So when they hear something like this, they may have a very different reaction than a white person basically saying, well, that was in the past, just move on. No, we can't just move on. We have to face it. We have to deal with it. And I think that white people sometimes are too quick to be dismissive of the pain and of the suffering that occurred in the past in this country. And it simply occurred because people were of a different color. Their skin had a different color, and then they suffered and were treated differently. It's easy for someone who's white to go, well, okay, slavery happened. That was a long time ago. It was bad. Move on. How did slavery have a profound impact on the generations that came after? I can't understand that. Jim Crow laws, segregation, all the different things that have occurred. It's like some foreign world. It's like something in a movie for me. But generations of African Americans, that has a profound impact in their family. I don't know how they discuss the issues. I don't know. I can't speak. I have no frame of reference. How are these things talked about in a black family? How do they discuss it with their children? I don't know. I don't understand that. Like, do they talk about the things that happened in the past? Do they talk about how that impacts the present? There's a lot there. And I think white people have got to be very careful not to be so dismissive of the horrible things that happen to people simply because of their race, simply because of the color of their skin. And it's horrific and it's tragic. And we got to stop being so dismissive of it. It's like white people it makes me uncomfortable and I don't like it. And I had nothing to do with it. And my family had nothing to do with it. I understand that. But it's still a part of our country, and we still want to deal with it and come face to face with it and see how we can move on past it. So I think there's got to be a lot. I think white people have to stop doing that. I'm just going to be blunt. We just got to stop doing that. Look, It's easy for me to say, look, no one in my family had anything to do with any of this. From my understanding, for my family tree, the first person of my family came from England to the United States of America. Then he fell in love with a Native American woman, married her, which got him in massive trouble with England. And I don't know all the things that happened. So that's kind of where my family comes from. There's nothing from my understanding in my past of anyone owning any slaves. There's nothing about any of that. Nobody was in Tulsa. Now obviously, I guarantee you there were people in my past who held to the ideals and the morality of the time and probably viewed African Americans in a way that a lot of people did back then. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But just because I can try to argue that I have as far as I know from everything I've learned about my past, nothing that would directly put me like in connection with any of this, it doesn't mean that doesn't diminish the pain. It just tries to make me feel better. But it's not about making me feel better. It's about how do we deal with this horrible history in the United States of America? How do we come face to face with it, and how do we move forward? All right. So I just think white people need to just be more willing to deal with the pain and the suffering, and not become so defensive. It's almost like, hey, did you hear about the Tulsa Race Massacre? Well, I'm not a racist. My family had nothing to do with it. Whoa, calm down. No one said you are. Take a deep breath. Okay, take a deep breath. Don't become so defensive. I think that's very important. Number 2. Oh boy. Here, I'm going to get myself in trouble here. I have grown very, very, very tired of this idea of critical race theory being the greatest danger to American Christianity that has ever existed. So many Christian podcasts, and we've talked about critical race theory. We've talked about its use as a hermeneutical device. I'm definitely got some issues with it. I'm not saying that. But I'm getting very tired that the way some Christian podcasters deal with it, some pastors deal with it, especially within the Southern Baptist Convention, that the greatest threat to the Southern Baptist Convention is critical race theory. The greatest threat to the Southern Baptist Convention and the greatest threat to their seminaries and the greatest threat to their churches preaching the gospel is critical race theory. And they want to fight about it and warn. And this is the warning. We got to talk about critical race theory. In the meantime, they don't want to talk about the sexual abuse of children that's happened in the Southern Baptist Convention, the sexual abuse of women. They don't want to talk about. They want to talk about critical race theory. They don't want to talk about all of the theological mess that you can find in Southern Baptist churches. No. Don't want to talk about that. Don't want to talk about all of the sin and problems within the church. No, we're going to talk about critical race theory. And the minute you talk about racism, you're almost viewed as immediately within many Christian churches, oh, you're a liberal, you're a Democrat, you believe in critical race theory, you're trying to be progressive, you're trying to be woke. And it's like, no, I'm trying to be a human being who looks into the history books and see that horrible things were done to people because of their race, and we need to condemn it, and we need to ensure that no racist ideals, philosophy, or mentality is present in the pew today. And we have to take a stand against it. I took a very strong stance when I became the pastor here in the middle of West Texas, that if you were in my church and you believe that it was wrong for an African-American man to marry a white woman, that you probably needed to find another church, because I would not tolerate that kind of thinking inside my church. Even if it meant losing everyone, I was not going to tolerate that. And I'll never forget, to this day, it's still one of the most heartbreaking things that ever happened to me. A African-American man and a white woman started visiting our church. And I think it was like a New Year's get-together, New Year's Eve get-together, and he came, even though he wasn't a member of the church, he came and was visiting, and then he started talking to me about theology, and I'll never forget this. Would it be okay if me and my wife started coming to your church all the time and possibly become a member? And I'm like, would it be okay? Why wouldn't it be okay? I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, we've gone to some churches before, and we were basically told that we were not welcome there because we're a mixed race couple. And I'm like, you went to a church and they told you were not welcome because you're a mixed race? I don't even know what mixed race means. You're two human beings who fell in love and got married. the color of your skin is irrelevant to the issue. But okay, I was like, ask me permission? I'm like, here's the thing. If you come into my church and anyone would ever say anything, they would be thrown out of my church so quick that you wouldn't even have time to know what happened, because I would never tolerate that. But that's the reality that some people's had to deal with. And the church, we've got to deal with the fact that we should do everything in our power to reflect, to speak against racism. But it's almost the way some white churches handle this. Well, nobody's here a racist, right? Okay. All right. Well, let's move on. We got other things to worry about, right? We got to worry about these liberals and woke and being woke. And we got to worry about LGBTQ, and we got to worry about abortion. Not saying that these issues are not important, but we act like that racism is never an issue that should be discussed in the Christian church. For example, there's a church here in my local area. I'm in Ovalo, so this is in Abilene, about 20 minutes from here. I've talked about this, who wanted, the pastor wanted to get like a book, like, hey, get everyone in the church, not during like a Sunday service or Sunday school, but like on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, don't even know when, get people to come to the church to meet, to talk about the book, White Fragility, right? And hey, let's have a discussion about this book. Everyone's talking about this book. Like, oh, people threatened to leave the church. People got mad. How dare you? We're not going to talk about this book. And it's like, well, we're never going to find out if there's, if white people are very fragile or not, because they won't even show up. Clearly, they're too fragile to talk about it. He wasn't saying agree with everything in the book. He was like, hey, let's discuss this book. This is very prevalent in our society. As Christians, let's look at it from a Christian perspective. Why is that a bad thing? But no. If you do that, if you even mention that, you're supposed to mention that book is bad. Hey, let's discuss Black Lives Matter. Yes, the organization supports some ideas that as Christians we're against it. But why do you think an organization like that is rising to prominence during this time? What's happening in our country in regards to race? What is a biblical perspective on race? How should we look at this? Christians need to have those conversations. There has been racism in the Christian church and the United States of America, and to deny that, you're out of your mind. To deny that, you're crazy. There's been churches who supported slavery. There was churches who supported segregation. There was churches who supported the Jim Crow laws. There were churches who and some will argue that the most segregated time in America is a Sunday morning, because you have black churches, you have white churches. Why do we have a black church and a white church? Why are we? No, we're Christians. We're not racist. Our identity is in Christ. Our identity is not in our race. Our identity is not in our background. We die to all of that. In fact, in my way of viewing it, when I become a Christian, all of that other stuff, my race, my origin, my family tree, my past, all of that, I die to all of that, because now my identity is found in Jesus Christ. It's not about, well, I'm Irish American, Native American, white American, Asian, all of that becomes to me irrelevant, because now we are one in Christ. That's what it's about. But for some people, those things are still important. Wonderful. Your family traditions. I don't have any family traditions because my family didn't have any traditions. Okay. So again, different way of being raised. But the church can't constantly just dismiss this, and I just don't understand why critical race theory is viewed as the greatest threat to the church. I still don't understand that. I don't see that. Look, to say, well, critical race theory is an attack upon biblical hermeneutics. Pastors have been attacking biblical hermeneutics from the way they've preached for pretty much 2,000 years, way before critical race theory ever became an issue. Churches that completely condemn critical race theory destroy biblical hermeneutics every time the pastor opens their mouth. So I think we've got to deal with it. So white Americans can't be dismissive of it. We've got to deal with it. And the church has to have a different way of talking about it. We've got to have some conversations and acknowledge and repent of the wrong that was done in the past, and to ensure that there is no racial nonsense going on in the minds of the people. You can always look at the people and think that they're good, godly people, but they could be good, godly people looking at you and they're racist all the way through, and they're thinking. That's got to be confronted. You say, well, they may get offended and leave. Let the racists leave, or let the racists repent, but don't tolerate the racism. All right? It's that simple. The church has to deal with it. And then here's the third thing. All right? So I know I'm talking about white Americans. I know I've talked about the church. Right? Now, here's the third thing. Our society has to have a long discussion with itself, all right? Our society, to me, is just so confusing to me. Now, we talked about this in the last episode, but let me remind you, our society today is dogmatic. It has its beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. And if you go against their beliefs of right and wrong, you're the heretic and you are to be silenced, censored, and condemned. So they just replaced one religion with their own religion. But at some point, everyone has to ask themselves, how do we judge the past? Now, again, I believe what happened in Tulsa was horrific, horrible, and ungodly and should be condemned. But I'm always baffled by what standard do we judge the past? Well, by what standard? If I look back into history and there's these tribes of, let's say we go back to an area where there were tribes, and these tribes were very brutal. And they would go and they would kill and make other tribes submit to them. They would take their women. They would take their children, kill their children, whatever horrible things they did. When we look back to that time, like there was this tribalism and these tribal wars, and they would take land and they would take property and they would take their women and they would do things to the children. And we look at it and we're like, man, that is all horrible. How do we judge that? What system of morality are we judging these things? Because in many cases, we're using our present morality to judge a past morality. But what makes the past morality wrong? Because at that time, they believed it was right. So what system of morality gives you the right to condemn them? Now, I'm not justifying the Tulsa Race Massacre. I'm just saying that there are so many issues in history. Slavery was a very common practice in many parts of the world. We condemn it now, but the morality at the time said it was right. So what makes the morality now better than the morality then? What makes one system of morality better than another system of morality? Who determines that? Who determines that? So we can look back and condemn people all day and go, they were bad, they were bad, they were bad, they were bad. But what makes them bad? What makes them bad? What makes you right? This is the discussion Christians have to have with the society. Well, I agree that is horrible. You want to point to something in history that's bad? I agree with you. It's horrible. It's tragic. But let me ask you a question. What makes it right, and what gives you the right to judge it and condemn it? What gives you the right to judge it and condemn it? This is a discussion about morality that we've got to force our society to have a discussion about, because no one's raising this question. Everyone would, you'll find young people who, basically have rejected Christianity, and they're on Twitter condemning this. This person needs to be censored. This person needs to be canceled. This person needs to be silenced. That's wrong. That's wrong. That movie is wrong. That's wrong. That's condemned. That movie should be banned. That movie is racist. That movie is sexist. That movie is misogynistic. That movie is transphobic. That movie is homophobic. And condemn. And I'm like, what gives you the right to condemn it? Where did you become the moral authority? And again, I know I'm repeating myself today, but I told you this is going to become a theme. Where does morality originate from? If you say the majority, well, that was the majority thinking at the time, so you can't condemn it. If you say the minority, well, I can point to some minorities right now who, in their way of thinking, that you would condemn. So it's not the majority, it's not the minority. If you say it was the individual, then you can't condemn it, because your individual morality has nothing to say about another person's individual morality. So what are you using to judge? It's like everyone wants to argue about the judgment people make, but no one wants to argue about the origin of the judging that is being made. Okay, like I'm not going to argue about the judgment you're making, whether you're right or whether you're wrong. I want to know how you're coming to the conclusion and what you're using to judge anything. That is the question we have to keep asking society. We've got to keep asking them that question. We cannot let up. They get irritated. They get mad when they get confronted with this question because they don't have an answer. They don't have anything. They don't have anything. And it's like, what makes someone's behavior wrong? What are you judging people's behavior on? It's like they got a book somewhere that tells them this is right and this is wrong, but it's not the Bible. Well, then what makes their book authoritative? Or at least we can claim it comes from God. So we've got to keep asking that question. So white Americans, stop being so fragile and getting so upset and so defensive when racism is brought up. Let's deal with it. Let's deal with it. All right. And secondly, we have to deal with racism in the church. And we can't, and stop making critical race theory like it's the greatest threat to Christianity. Let's deal with the racism in the pew, and let's challenge it and call for repentance of it. Right? I think it's very important, very, very important. And third, we got to deal with the morality question. It's not going to go away. We've got to deal with the morality question. And then one more very important topic here. What role does the rise of Darwinian evolution in the past, what role did it play in racial and racist ideology? Now, we've got to ask this question. I know people don't like this. I'm not making a scientific argument here about evolution. I'm not getting into that debate. People sometimes think that that's what this debate is. No. The reason I raise this question, if you read any of the books, the Tarzan books, I can't remember how many of them. I've read all of them. But if you read the Tarzan books, you're like, oh, that's just a story about a guy swinging on a vine. And there's a lot of philosophical concepts that arise within the Tarzan books. And one of them is very racist. And I'm waiting for when these books get canceled in our society. You may want to purchase them now while you still can, because you should just see it for yourself. You can tell me what you think. You read them. But they speak of blacks basically as like they're basically an ape, like they're basically a gorilla, like they're not evolved as the white man. The white man is superior. The black is subservient, basically not evolved. If we're going to talk about racist things in the past, do we not need to look at possibly where some of the ideology originated from? Because wasn't one of the arguments was that they were basically animals? Did Darwinian evolution contribute to that way of thinking? I'm not going to say it originated that way of thinking, but did it contribute? Or did it originate? I think we could even ask that question. Did they have a scientific basis to say, see, they're not fully evolved? We're fully evolved. They're basically animals, so we can treat them as an animal. We can, isn't that kind of, we treat it, isn't that what happens in many cases when a certain group of people are basically, we dehumanize them. If we take away their humanity, then we can treat them like an animal. If we take away their humanity, they're a savage, they're whatever words you want to use, and then they can be brutalized, killed, enslaved, made to submit because they're basically an animal. They're basically a dog. Well, did evolutionary concepts, were they utilized for that purpose? Even though I'm not saying that would have been Darwin's intent, but when you start going, okay, here's evolution, here's how this group evolved, here's this group evolved, and if you can make some kind of argument that group is still they're lower in the evolutionary chain, well, then that means you don't have to treat them as fully human, then. And I just think we have to, and we could go back to the moral question again. Why is it even immoral to enslave some people? Why is racism immoral? What makes it immoral? Well, because they're human beings. Well, what is a human being? Is a human being something special or unique, or is it just an animal that evolved? Like, there are moral questions. When the society wants to talk about these issues, don't fight them. Welcome the discussion. By all means, let's condemn wrong. Let's say wrong is wrong. But at some point I have to ask you, what makes it wrong? This has to be discussed when we're talking about all of these issues. They have to be discussed. I think the Darwinian part is very important. And then I will just end with this. This is so important. Within Christianity, I'm putting on my glasses here. Within Christianity, there's a very important teaching. I've already alluded to it, but I think it's very important. That for Christians, our identity is not in our race. Our identity is not in anything other than in Christ. We've got to get back to teaching that we die to self It's not about self-identity. It's not about all of that is gone. It's now my identity in Christ, following Christ, serving Christ. That's what we have to try to get back to making that our identity. We've got to get back to that. And that within Christianity, it's not about the race of the individual. It's about their identity in Christ. And if they're not a Christian, then I see their identity as a human being created by God in the image of God. And I need to see the image of God in them, not their race. I don't see anything else. I see the image of God. That's what we have to see. But we've got to get back to some biblical concepts. We got to get back to some biblical concepts. I could expand on that, but I'll stop right there. Just some thoughts on this very important topic, very important subject, and very relevant to the world right now. There's so many discussions about all of this, and I just the world has taken control of the discussion. But they don't feel that they have to have any basis for the morality, which they not only do they state, they are dogmatic about. And I think it's a discussion we need to force the world to have. All right, I'll stop right there. I'm going to try to be back on the air here shortly with some other studies today, and we'll see what else we can get done before I have to go get some food. All right, if you have any questions, email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. All right, God bless.